A crowded airport terminal, the hum of 1,000 conversations, the roll of suitcases, the distant roar of a jet engine. For most, it's a place of transition, of hellos and goodbyes. But on a crisp autumn morning at Chicago's O'Hare International, for one TSA officer, it became an arena of judgment. He saw a black woman, poised and professional, and in his mind, he saw a threat. He chose to make an example of her, to wield his small authority like a weapon. He called her suspicious. He intended to humiliate her. What he didn't know was that he wasn't profiling a civilian. He was about to confront the full, unblinking power of the United States government, and the silence that followed would be the sound of his entire world crumbling. Dr. Imani Hayes moved with the practiced economy of a person who understood time not as a luxury, but as a tactical asset. Her journey through the bustling concourse of O'Hare International Airport was a study in quiet efficiency. Her charcoal grey pantsuit was impeccably tailored, practical, yet elegant, betraying nothing of the immense responsibility that rested on her shoulders. Her carry-on, a sleek, durable Toomey laptop bag, was slung over one shoulder, its weight familiar and grounding. Inside, secured in a cryptographically sealed hard drive, were preliminary findings for a national security briefing at the FBI's headquarters in Washington, D.C. The contents were sensitive enough that commercial travel was a calculated risk, but a necessary one. The air in Terminal 3 was thick with the usual symphony of travel, the tinny announcements over the PA system, the distant laughter of a child, the low rumble of thousands of rolling suitcase wheels against polished linoleum. Imani was an observer by nature and by trade. She noted the anxious family rushing towards Gate K-12, the young couple stealing a final kiss, the businessman barking into his phone about quarterly reports. It was a river of humanity, and she was just one more anonymous current within it. That anonymity was her shield. She approached the TSA checkpoint with the same placid demeanor she brought to every task. She'd done this hundreds of times. Shoes off, laptop out, liquids in the clear bag, pockets empty. A mundane ritual for a life that was anything but. She placed her belongings into the grey plastic bins and pushed them onto the conveyor belt, her eyes briefly scanning the line, the officers, the machinery. A threat assessment was as natural to her as breathing. That's when she first saw him. TSA officer Kevin Miller. He was a man who seemed to wear his uniform like a suit of armor, puffing his chest out slightly, a permanent sneer etched onto his face as if he'd just smelled something unpleasant. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, but he carried himself with an air of unearned superiority. His eyes, small and restless, scanned the passengers not with the diligence of a security professional, but with the predatory gaze of someone looking for a target. Imani felt his eyes linger on her for a fraction of a second too long. It was a familiar feeling, a subtle shift in atmospheric pressure that she had been trained to detect in far more dangerous environments. She ignored it, retrieving her bins from the other side of the X-ray machine. As she began to put on her shoes, she heard a sharp, demanding voice. "Ma'am, this bag needs a secondary screening." Imani looked up. Officer Miller was holding her Toomey bag, holding it almost contemptuously between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were contaminated. He wasn't looking at the bag, he was looking directly at her. "Of course," Imani replied, her voice even and calm. This was standard procedure. An anomaly on the screen, a dense object. It happened. She stepped to the designated search area, a sterile stainless steel table, expecting a routine swab and a quick look inside. But Miller didn't move towards the swabbing station. He placed her bag on the table with a thud that was unnecessarily loud, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. He snapped on a pair of blue nitrile gloves with an exaggerated crackle. Anything in this bag I should know about? Anything sharp? Any undeclared items?" His tone was laced with insinuation, as if she were a common smuggler. "No, officer," Imani said, keeping her voice level. "Standard electronics. A laptop, tablet, chargers, and some paperwork." The word paperwork felt comically inadequate for the classified documents on the hard drive, but it was the truth. Miller smirked. It was a cold, unpleasant expression. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "You just look a little suspicious." The word hung in the air, ugly and charged. Suspicious. It wasn't the bag, it was her, the suit, the calm demeanor, the color of her skin. It had all been fed into his prejudiced calculus, and this was the result. The river of humanity around them seemed to pause. Conversations faltered, heads turned. Imani felt a dozen pairs of eyes on her, and the shield of her anonymity began to crack. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her extensive training kicking in, telling her to remain impassive, to de-escalate. But beneath the calm, a cold fire was beginning to ignite. The secondary screening area was supposed to be a place of procedural routine. It was designed to be efficient, discreet, and professional. In the hands of Officer Kevin Miller, it became a stage. He seemed to relish the audience he had created, the circle of curious and uncomfortable travelers now watching his personal theater of power. "Let's have a look, shall we?" he said, unzipping the main compartment of Imani's bag. He did not begin with a systematic search as protocol dictated. Instead, he began pulling items out one by one and placing them on the steel table for all to see. First, the laptop in its sleeve. He tapped it. "What kind of work do you do that requires a machine like this?" he asked, his tone implying it was beyond her station. "I'm a consultant," Imani replied, the lie easy and practiced. It was her standard cover for civilian interactions, vague, professional, and uninteresting. "A consultant," Miller repeated, drawing the word out as if it were absurd. "Right." He pulled out her tablet, a small toiletry bag, a paperback novel. Then came a neatly bound folder. It contained unclassified printouts for her flight, backup reading material. He flipped through it with a dismissive air. Lots of reading material. Very studious. Imani remained silent, her posture unwavering. Her heart rate was steady, a testament to years of training in high-stress situations. She was cataloguing everything. Miller's words, his body language, the placement of the CCTV cameras, the faces in the crowd. She noted a young woman with a red scarf a few feet away, who had subtly angled her phone downwards, the screen's reflection showing it was recording. Good. Witnesses were always a variable, but often a useful one. The search became more invasive. Miller unzipped a smaller side pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He opened it and dumped the contents onto the table. A few pens, a high-end flash drive, and a set of highly specialized lockpicks. The picks were part of her FBI-issued field kit, tools of the trade for certain covert operations. To a civilian eye, they were unequivocally incriminating. Miller's eyes lit up with vindictive glee. He held up one of the picks. "And what are these for?" "Consultant," he sneered, his voice dripping with triumph. "Consulting on how to break into things." A murmur went through the small crowd. The accusation was plain. Now she wasn't just suspicious. She was a potential criminal. "They are tools for my trade," Imani said, her voice dropping a fraction of a degree, a cold edge now sharpening her words. "I would advise you to be careful with them." "Oh, I'll be careful," Miller shot back, his arrogance swelling. He felt he had her cornered. "I'm always careful with potential evidence." He gestured vaguely to another TSA agent. "Hey, get Davies over here. I think we've got a real situation." The request for a supervisor was the correct protocol, but his reason was not. He wasn't requesting a supervisor for guidance. He was summoning an audience for his victory. Imani knew the situation had crossed a critical threshold. The lockpicks, combined with the encrypted hard drive still in her bag, could create a bureaucratic nightmare if handled by incompetent or malicious hands. More importantly, her flight to DC was in less than an hour. The briefing she was attending involved an imminent and credible threat. Missing it was not an option. Supervisor Davies arrived a few minutes later. He was a harried-looking man in his late 50s, his uniform slightly rumpled, his expression weary. He looked at the scene, the scattered contents of the bag, the lockpicks on the table, the silent black woman in the power suit, and his overzealous officer, puffed up with self-importance. "What's going on here, Miller?" Davies asked, his voice low. "Standard secondary search, sir," Miller reported proudly. "Passenger was acting suspiciously, uncooperative, and I found these." He pointed dramatically at the lockpicks. "Burglary tools." Davies sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked at Imani. "Ma'am, can you explain these items?" Before Imani could speak, Miller interjected. "She says she's a consultant. Real vague, refusing to cooperate." "I have not refused anything," Imani stated, her gaze fixed on Supervisor Davies, deliberately cutting Miller out of the conversation. "I have answered every question. Your officer has chosen to conduct this search in an unprofessional and accusatory manner. Those are specialized tools for my work." Davies seemed torn. On one hand, he had a procedural issue and a potentially problematic employee. On the other, he had a set of lockpicks on the table. The path of least resistance was to back his officer. "Ma'am, you have to understand our position," Davies began, adopting a placating, bureaucratic tone. "These items are highly unusual. We're going to need to take you to a private room to discuss this further. We may have to involve the airport police." The threat was clear. Detention, interrogation, a missed flight, a failed mission. Imani's mind raced through the protocols. She had a duty to protect her cover and the classified material, but she also had a duty to complete her assignment. Miller's blatant profiling and Davies's weak-willed complicity had turned a minor inconvenience into a potential obstruction of a federal investigation. She looked from Davies's tired, avoidant eyes to Miller's smug, triumphant face. They had left her no choice. The time for quiet compliance was over. The time for de-escalation had passed. She gave them one last chance. "Supervisor Davies," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "You have two options. You can instruct your officer to carefully return my belongings to my bag, and I will proceed to my gate. Or you can continue down this path. I assure you, you will regret the second option." Miller laughed out loud, a short, ugly bark. "Is that a threat?" Davies frowned. "Mart, I don't appreciate being threatened." Imani looked at him, a profound disappointment in her eyes. "It wasn't a threat, Supervisor," she said softly, the calm returning to her voice. But this time it was a different kind of calm. It was the stillness at the center of a hurricane. It was a professional courtesy. She then slowly, deliberately, reached into the main compartment of her still open bag. Miller tensed, his hand instinctively moving towards his radio. "Careful what you're reaching for," he warned. Imani ignored him. Her fingers bypassed the folder and the hard drive, closing around a small, familiar leather wallet. She pulled it out, flipped it open, and held it up for both men to see. The small enclosed world of the TSA checkpoint seemed to fall silent. The background hum of the airport, the chatter of passengers, the beep of the scanners, it all faded into a muted roar. The only thing that felt real was the object in Imani's hand. It was her FBI credentials, The gold shield gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal, a stark and brilliant contrast to the dark leather. Beside it, her photograph, clear and professional, stared out from under the words: United States Department of Justice, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And beneath that, her name and title: Special Agent Imani Hayes. She didn't say a word. She simply held it there, steady and sure, letting the weight of it fill the space between them. Officer Kevin Miller's smug expression dissolved as if it were made of sand. His face went through a rapid, almost comical series of transformations. First, blank confusion, as his brain struggled to process the information. Then, a flicker of disbelief, his eyes darting from the badge to her face and back again. Finally, the dawning horror. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly pallor. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The man who had been so loud, so full of bluster and authority just moments before, was rendered utterly mute. Supervisor Davies reacted differently. His was the panic of a career bureaucrat who suddenly realized he was standing on a landmine. His eyes widened, and he took an involuntary step back, as if the badge itself were physically pushing him away. He looked at Imani, then at Miller, then at the scattered contents of her bag, the lockpicks, the sensitive electronics, and the full, catastrophic scope of the situation crashed down upon him. This wasn't an uncooperative passenger. This was a federal agent, on duty, and his employee had just publicly accused her of being a criminal, threatening her with detention while she was likely en route to a matter of national importance. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. The passengers who had been watching the drama unfold now stared, their expressions a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. The young woman with the red scarf, Jessica Riley, who had been recording, now held her phone up more openly, ensuring she captured the frozen tableau of the two TSA employees staring at the FBI shield. Imani finally broke the silence. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the tension like a scalpel. "Officer Miller," she said, her eyes locked onto his. "Supervisor Davies, as I was saying, I have a flight to catch." She snapped the credentials shut and placed them back in her bag. Her movements were precise and unhurried. She began to pack her belongings, placing the lockpick set carefully into its pouch, sliding the laptop back into its sleeve. Davies finally found his voice, though it was strained and choked. Agent Hayes, there's been a misunderstanding, a terrible misunderstanding." Imani didn't look at him. She continued packing. "There has been no misunderstanding, Supervisor. Your officer profiled me based on my appearance. When his baseless assumptions were not validated, he escalated the situation, publicly humiliating me and fabricating a reason to detain me. You, in turn, failed to de-escalate, failed to follow proper procedure, and chose to enable his behavior. What you misunderstood was the identity of the person you were dealing with, not the nature of your actions." Each word was a perfectly placed hammer blow, dismantling their excuses before they could even be fully formed. Miller, still pale, finally managed to stammer. I was just doing my job. The pics, as you call them, are government property." Imani cut him off, her voice like ice. "Tools you have now contaminated and compromised by displaying them in a public setting. Every second you delay me further is another second you are actively obstructing a federal agent in the performance of her duties. That is a felony, Officer Miller. Title 18, Section 111 of the U.S. Code. Look it up." She zipped her bag shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the quieted space. She slung it over her shoulder and stood to her full height, her gaze sweeping over both men. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with seismic force. They were no longer the authority figures questioning a suspicious traveler. They were two men who had just made the biggest mistake of their professional lives, standing before the consequences. "I will be filing a formal complaint," Imani stated, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. "With the Department of Homeland Security, the TSA Administrator, and the Office of the Inspector General. I will be requisitioning all surveillance footage of this checkpoint for the last 30 minutes. And I will need your names and badge numbers." Davies fumbled for his own ID, his hands trembling slightly. "Davies. William Davies. Badge number 7834. Imani looked at Miller, whose entire body seemed to have shrunk. He couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the floor, mumbling. "Miller. Kevin Miller. 90122. "Thank you," Imani said curtly. She turned to leave, but then paused, looking back at them one last time. "And just so we're clear," she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "You didn't find me suspicious. You found me to be a black woman, and you decided I didn't belong. You were wrong." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the two men standing frozen by the stainless steel table, surrounded by the wreckage of their authority. The silence they had created by singling her out now belonged to them, a heavy, suffocating blanket of their own making. As Imani walked towards her gate, the muted hum of the airport slowly returned, but for Kevin Miller and William Davies, the silence in their own heads was just beginning. It was the sound of a freefall. As Imani Hayes walked away from the security checkpoint, her calm exterior remained a perfect, unbroken shell. Inside, however, a controlled storm of emotions was raging. There was anger, cold and sharp, at the casual bigotry she had endured. There was frustration at the unnecessary delay and the potential compromise to her mission. But overriding it all was a deep, wearying disappointment. She carried a badge that represented the highest ideals of justice in the nation, yet she was constantly reminded that for some, her skin color would always be the only credential they saw. She didn't head directly to her gate. Instead, she found a less crowded area with a view of the tarmac, the massive jets moving with a slow, ponderous grace. She pulled out her encrypted government-issued phone. Her thumbs moved swiftly across the screen, bypassing the standard interface and opening a secure communication app. She had to report this, not just as a complaint, but as an operational security breach. Her first message was a text to a specific number, the direct line for the special agent in charge of the Chicago field office, Robert Sterling. Imani Hayes, Code 7 at ORD Terminal 3. Encounter with TSA resulted in exposure of non-critical equipment. Mission timeline is tight but intact. Requesting full retention of all CCTV footage from Checkpoint Bravo, 0830 to 809:15, Central Time. Full report to follow. A Code 7 was an internal FBI designation for an incident involving obstruction or harassment by another government agency. It was serious. Sterling, a man not known for his patience or his love of interagency squabbles, replied in less than 20 seconds. Robert Sterling. Acknowledged. Stand by. Imani knew what that meant. Sterling was a bulldog, fiercely protective of his agents and the Bureau's integrity. Stand by meant he was already making calls, setting gears into motion that Miller and Davies couldn't possibly comprehend. The surveillance footage wouldn't just be requested, it would be seized under federal authority before anyone had a chance to delete or alter it. Her second action was a call. She scrolled to another contact. DHS liaison. This was the official channel. This was for the record. A man answered on the first ring. Director's office. This is Agent Foster. Agent Foster, this is Special Agent Hayes, FBI, Imani said, her tone formal and clipped. I need to report an incident at O'Hare. I am officially lodging a complaint against TSA officer Kevin Miller, badge number 91222, and his supervisor, William Davies, badge number 7834, for unlawful profiling, harassment, and obstruction of a federal agent in the performance of her duties. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. The word obstruction had a specific and grave meaning in this context. Understood, Agent Hayes, Foster said, his voice now noticeably more alert. Can you provide a summary of the incident? Imani recounted the events with detached, clinical precision. She reported Miller's suspicious comment. The public and disorganized search of her bag, the discovery of her tools, and the threat of detention. She detailed Davies's failure to intervene and his complicity in the escalation. She left out the emotion, presenting only the facts. The facts were damning enough. My credentials were only produced when it became clear that their actions were going to prevent me from boarding my flight, thereby jeopardizing a national security operation, she concluded. Jeopardizing a... I see, Agent Foster said slowly. Thank you, Agent Hayes. We take allegations of this nature extremely seriously. An immediate inquiry will be opened by the Office of Professional Responsibility. You will be contacted for a formal statement. I expect to be, Imani said. I also expect to be kept appraised of the disciplinary action taken. The Bureau will be following this closely. She disconnected the call. As she put her phone away, she saw her. The young woman with the red scarf from the checkpoint, Jessica Riley, was standing a few feet away, looking hesitant. Excuse me, Jessica said, her voice a little shaky. I'm so sorry to bother you. I saw what happened back there. It was unbelievable. I got the whole thing on video. Imani assessed her. She seemed genuine, outraged on her behalf. Thank you for your concern, Imani said politely. I'm a lawyer, Jessica added, as if to explain herself. An associate at a civil rights firm downtown. What that man did was not just unprofessional, it was illegal. The profiling was textbook. If you need a witness or a copy of this video for your complaint, I'm happy to provide it. My name is Jessica Riley. She held out a business card. Imani took the card. In her line of work, civilian witnesses could be unpredictable. But a lawyer, a civil rights lawyer who knew exactly what she was looking at, that was a powerful asset. Thank you, Ms. Riley. I may be in touch, Imani said. She then allowed a small, wry smile. Though I have a feeling this matter will be handled internally. Jessica nodded, understanding the implication. I hope they throw the book at him, she said, with feeling. At both of them. Imani's phone buzzed again. It was another text from Sterling. Robert Sterling. Footage secured. O'Hare Security and Chicago PD are standing by. Do you require an escort to your gate? Imani typed her reply. Imani Hayes. Negative. Situation is contained. Proceeding to gate now. Thank you, Rob. She gave a final nod to Jessica Riley and walked towards her gate, her stride confident and purposeful once more. The initial storm within her had subsided, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. The incident was no longer just a personal affront. It was now an official FBI matter. A case file had been opened. A chain of command had been activated. For Kevin Miller and William Davies, sitting in some sterile break room back at the checkpoint, the world had simply gone quiet. They had no idea that the silence was the sound of a federal hammer being drawn back, preparing to strike. Back at Checkpoint Bravo, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with aviation security. After Imani Hayes walked away, Officer Miller and Supervisor Davies stood in a state of suspended animation, the gazes of their colleagues and the lingering passengers burning into them. The routine beeps and commands of the checkpoint seemed to mock their sudden irrelevance. Their paralysis was broken by the sharp, authoritative voice of a woman in a dark blue suit. "Miller! Davies! With me! Now!" She was Helen Pierce, the on-site TSA Assistant Federal Security Director. She was a formidable figure, a career official who had seen it all and had zero tolerance for incidents that brought negative attention to her command. Her face was a mask of controlled fury. She led them away from the public checkpoint and into a stark, windowless office. The silence in the room was absolute. Pierce closed the door and turned to face them, her arms crossed. She didn't speak for a full minute, letting the weight of their failure press down on them. "I have just spent the last 10 minutes on the phone with the FBI's Chicago field office," she began, her voice dangerously low. "Specifically with Special Agent in Charge Robert Sterling. He is displeased. That is the most generous word I can use. He informed me that 2 of my officers saw fit to harass, publicly humiliate, and attempt to illegally detain one of his top agents while she was on her way to a national security briefing at FBI headquarters." She paused, her eyes boring into Miller. "Officer Miller, in your report, which you haven't written yet, but I can already guess what it would say, what was your primary justification for the secondary screening?" Miller, still visibly shaken, stammered, Her demeanor, ma'am. She was evasive. And then the items in the bag." "Her demeanor." Pierce cut him off. "Let me read you a direct quote from SAC Sterling, who has known Agent Hayes for 12 years. Agent Hayes has the calmest demeanor of anyone I've ever met. She once negotiated a hostage situation with a heart rate of 70 beats per minute. The only thing evasive about her is the file on a domestic terror cell she was flying to D.C. to brief the director about." The color, which had begun to return to Miller's face, vanished once more. Davies flinched as if he'd been struck. Pierce continued, her voice relentless. "And the items? The lockpicks? Sterling also informed me that those are standard issue for her unit, and by displaying them publicly, you may have compromised an ongoing covert investigation. The Legal Affairs Division at Homeland Security is already drafting memos about the potential fallout." She turned her icy gaze to Davies. "And you, Supervisor Davies, your job is to oversee your officers, to ensure protocol is followed, and to de-escalate situations. From the preliminary report I received, you did none of those things. You allowed your officer to run a circus on the checkpoint floor, and then you backed his play, threatening a federal agent with police involvement. Did you at any point attempt to verify this woman's story? Did you offer a private screening room as per protocol for a contentious search? Or did you simply take the word of an officer known for his high number of passenger complaints?" Davies wilted under the interrogation. I thought he had reasonable suspicion. I was trying to support my team." "You weren't supporting your team. You were enabling a lawsuit," Pierce snapped. "And not just a lawsuit. SAC Sterling made it very clear that the Bureau is considering this an official obstruction case. The Department of Justice will be handling the investigation, not us. We are now secondary. Our role is simply to cooperate." She let that sink in. The Department of Justice. This was no longer an internal TSA disciplinary matter. This was federal. "Both of you are suspended, effective immediately," Pierce declared. "You will surrender your badges and airport credentials. You will be escorted from the premises. You are not to contact any other TSA employees. You are not to access any TSA systems. A formal investigation has been launched. You will be contacted by an investigator from the DHS Office of the Inspector General. I suggest you find legal counsel. Now give me your IDs." The act of unclipping their badges was a moment of profound humiliation. Those small pieces of plastic had been the source of their power, their identity within this airport. Now they were just two men in uniforms they no longer had the right to wear. As a security escort arrived to walk them out, Miller made one last desperate plea. "Ms. Pierce, it was a mistake. I just made a bad call." Pierce looked at him with something akin to pity, but it was cold and hard. "Officer Miller, you didn't make a bad call. You made a choice. You chose to see a respected federal agent as a threat because she didn't fit your idea of what a professional looks like. You chose to abuse your authority, and choices have consequences." The escort led them out a back hallway, away from the public eye. They walked past employee locker rooms and drab corridors, the route a reverse of the one they proudly took every morning. It was a walk of shame. Meanwhile, in another part of the airport, a different kind of procedure was underway. Two plainclothes FBI agents had arrived at the TSA security office. They weren't there to ask, they were there to collect. "We're here for the CCTV assets from Checkpoint Bravo, time-stamped 8:30 to 09:15, the lead agent said, presenting a federal warrant to the stunned IT manager. "All angles. We need the raw, uncompressed files. Now." The machinery of federal power, once activated, moved with terrifying speed and efficiency. Every angle of the encounter, every word, every gesture, was now evidence. The digital recording from Jessica Riley's phone would soon be added to that file, a crystal-clear, ground-level view of the entire humiliation. While Miller and Davies were being stripped of their authority, Imani Hayes was boarding her flight. She took her seat in the business-class cabin, the airline having upgraded her as a courtesy after a quiet word from the FBI's travel office. As the plane pushed back from the gate, she looked out the window at the sprawling complexity of O'Hare. From here, the checkpoint was an insignificant speck, but she knew that on that tiny speck of land, a process had begun that would be anything but insignificant for the two men who had so profoundly underestimated her. The karma wasn't just coming, it was already here, and its gears were just beginning to grind. The days that followed the incident at O'Hare were, for Imani Hayes, a return to normalcy, or what passed for normal in her line of work. The briefing in Washington was a success. The intelligence she provided led to the disruption of a credible threat, a quiet victory that would never make the headlines, but would save lives. She flew back to Chicago 2 days later, passing through the same airport, the same terminal, without incident. It was as if the confrontation had never happened, but it had. And beneath the surface, the gears of a vast and unforgiving bureaucracy were grinding away, chewing up the careers of Kevin Miller and William Davies. The investigation was led not by the TSA's internal affairs, who were seen as too compromised, but by a senior investigator from the Department of Homeland Security's Office of the Inspector General, OIG, a man named Arthur Chen. Chen was a meticulous, humorless bulldog of an investigator, known for his relentless pursuit of facts. His first step was to review the evidence. He had the complete, high-definition CCTV footage from every conceivable angle. He had the audio logs. He had a copy of the video from Jessica Riley's phone, which the FBI had politely requested from her. And he had a formal, 20-page sworn statement from Special Agent Imani Hayes. Chen watched the footage in a soundproofed room at the DHS regional office. He saw Miller's initial, predatory scanning of the crowd. He saw the way his eyes locked onto Imani. He saw the performative, aggressive search. He could hear, through the enhanced audio, every condescending word, culminating in the venomous accusation, You just look suspicious." He then compared this to the official logs. Over the past year, Officer Kevin Miller had initiated 342 secondary screenings. Of those, 78% were performed on people of color. Of that 78%, only one search, a tourist who had forgotten a large Swiss Army knife in his bag, had yielded a prohibited item. The numbers painted a stark, undeniable picture of racial profiling. Miller wasn't a security officer. He was a gatekeeper for his own prejudices. Next, Chen interviewed Supervisor William Davies. In a sterile interrogation room, Davies crumbled. He admitted he had long been aware of Miller's aggressive style and the unusually high number of complaints filed against him. He had chosen to ignore them, writing them off as personality conflicts rather than addressing the clear pattern of misconduct. "Why?" Chen asked, his voice flat. "He got results," Davies mumbled. "His searches were fast. It kept the line moving. I didn't want to rock the boat." "You didn't rock the boat," Chen replied, his voice laced with contempt. "You allowed a cancer to grow in your checkpoint. And on Tuesday, that cancer metastasized and attacked an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The most damning part of the investigation came from Miller himself. Accompanied by a union-appointed lawyer, Miller was defiant. He stuck to his story that Agent Hayes had been acting suspiciously, that his actions were justified by the discovery of the lockpicks. "It's my job to detect threats," Miller said, his voice regaining some of its old arrogance. "I saw a potential threat, and I acted on it. I shouldn't be punished for doing my job." Chen let him finish. Then he slid a file across the table. "This is your performance review from 6 months ago, Officer Miller. In it, Supervisor Davies notes that you need to improve your interpersonal skills with passengers and adhere more closely to screening protocols instead of relying on instinct." He wrote that. "The same supervisor who you claim supported your actions." Miller's face paled. Chen continued, relentless. "Furthermore, we've cross-referenced your incident reports with the passenger manifests. On at least 15 occasions, you have filed reports describing passengers as agitated or uncooperative to justify invasive searches. We contacted 5 of those passengers. They are all minority business professionals. All 5 stated that your description was a complete fabrication and that you were the one who was aggressive and unprofessional from the start. What you call doing your job, Officer Miller, the federal government calls a pattern of falsifying official reports to cover for civil rights violations." The room fell silent. Miller's lawyer put a hand on his client's arm, but it was too late. Miller had built his entire defense on a foundation of lies, and Arthur Chen had just dynamited it. The OIG report, when it was finalized, was a brutal, systematic takedown of not just 2 employees, but of a pocket of toxic culture within the O'Hare TSA. It concluded that Officer Miller had engaged in a prolonged pattern of racial profiling, falsification of federal documents, and abuse of authority. It found Supervisor Davies guilty of gross negligence, dereliction of duty, and willful blindness to the misconduct of his subordinate. The report was sent to 3 places simultaneously: the head of the TSA, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the Public Integrity Section of the Department of Justice. The administrative penalties were swift. Both Miller and Davies were terminated immediately, their careers in federal service over. But for Kevin Miller, the consequences were just beginning. The Department of Justice wasn't interested in just firing him. They were interested in prosecuting him. The pattern of falsified reports and the sheer audacity of his actions against a federal agent had caught the attention of a young, ambitious assistant U.S. attorney named Ben Carter. Carter saw more than just a firing offense. He saw a crime. The indictment landed 6 weeks after the incident. It wasn't a quiet firing or a forced resignation. It was a federal grand jury indictment, a public document that laid out the charges in stark, unforgiving legal language. United States of America v. Kevin P. Miller. Count 1. Deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. paragraph 242. Count 2. Falsification of federal records, 18 U.S.C. paragraph 1001. Count 3. Obstruction of agency functions, 18 U.S.C. paragraph 155. The news broke on a Wednesday. The Chicago Tribune ran the headline, "Fired TSA officer federally indicted for profiling, harassing FBI agent at O'Hare." The story, fueled by leaks from the DOJ and a damning on-the-record quote from Jessica Riley's civil rights firm, went viral. Jessica's video, now evidence in a federal case, was released to the media, and millions of people watched the smug TSA officer's face crumble as Imani Hayes revealed her badge. For Kevin Miller, life became a nightmare. His name was everywhere. His face was on the evening news. He was no longer an anonymous officer in a blue shirt. He was the poster child for government overreach and racial profiling. His neighbors stared. His friends stopped calling. The union lawyer who had represented him during the internal investigation informed him that their services didn't extend to a federal criminal trial. He had to hire a private attorney, draining his savings account in a matter of weeks. William Davies, though not criminally charged, faced his own personal hell. Fired for gross negligence, his federal pension was jeopardized. He was unemployable in the security field. The shame of his failure followed him everywhere. He had to sell his house in the suburbs and move into a small apartment. His sin wasn't malice, but weakness, and he was paying a steep price. The trial of Kevin Miller took place in the Dirksen Federal Courthouse in downtown Chicago. Assistant U.S. Attorney Ben Carter was masterful. He presented a mountain of evidence: the airport surveillance footage, Miller's own damning personnel file, the testimony of other passengers Miller had profiled. The star witness, however, was Dr. Imani Hayes. She took the stand, dressed in the same type of professional, understated suit she had worn that day at the airport. She recounted the events with the same calm, factual precision she had used in her official reports. She did not raise her voice. She did not appear angry. She simply stated what had happened. Miller's defense attorney tried to paint her as an arrogant federal agent, throwing her weight around. "Agent Hayes," the lawyer began, "isn't it true that you could have shown your credentials at any time? You waited, didn't you? You waited until you could cause the maximum amount of embarrassment for my client." Imani looked directly at the jury. "My job," she said, her voice clear and steady, "is to blend in, to not draw attention to myself. The moment I show my credentials, my anonymity is gone. I become a target. I was traveling with sensitive national security information. Revealing my identity as an FBI agent in a crowded airport is a last resort, not a first option. I revealed it only when your client's illegal actions left me no other choice to complete my mission and prevent him from unlawfully detaining me." She then turned her gaze to the defense attorney. "Furthermore, the issue is not when I showed my badge. The issue is why I had to. I was subjected to treatment that no citizen, regardless of their profession, should endure. The only difference between me and the dozens of other people your client has profiled is that my ID carried a shield on it. The crime was committed long before I ever reached into my bag." The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. At the sentencing hearing, the judge was scathing. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice echoing in the solemn courtroom, "you were entrusted with the authority of the United States government to protect its citizens. Instead, you used that authority as a cudgel to enforce your own pathetic prejudices. You tarnished the uniform you wore, and you violated the sacred trust placed in you. The fact that your victim turned out to be a federal agent is a twist of karmic irony. But your crime would have been just as egregious had she been a school teacher, a doctor, or a tourist. Kevin Miller, the man who had stood so tall and smug at his little kingdom in the airport, stood before the judge and wept. He was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. Not a country club prison, but a low-security federal correctional institution. For a man who had spent his career on the side of law enforcement, it was the ultimate humiliation. The conviction of Kevin Miller sent shockwaves through the Transportation Security Administration. It was a clear and unambiguous message. This behavior would not be tolerated, and the consequences would be severe. In the months that followed, real change began to happen. The TSA launched a nationwide review of its secondary screening selection process. The training curriculum for new officers was completely overhauled, with a new, intensive module on implicit bias and de-escalation, a module designed in consultation with civil rights groups and, unofficially, with input from the Department of Justice, which used the Miller case as a textbook example of systemic failure. The O'Hare incident became a mandatory case study for all TSA supervisors. For Imani Hayes, life went on. She continued her vital work at the FBI, a silent guardian in a world of unseen threats. She never sought the spotlight, and her name was eventually replaced by other headlines. But her actions had created a lasting echo. She received a formal letter of commendation from the Director of the FBI and a personal letter of apology from the Secretary of Homeland Security. One afternoon, months after the trial, she received an email from Jessica Riley, the young lawyer who had filmed the encounter. Subject: a small update. Dear Agent Hayes, I hope this email finds you well. I'm writing because I wanted you to know that, inspired by your case, my firm has just launched a new pro bono project dedicated to assisting individuals who have been victims of profiling at airports. We've already taken on 2 cases. I wanted to thank you. Your strength that day gave a voice to so many people who don't have one. You didn't just win a case. You started a conversation and created an opportunity for real change. All the best. Jessica Riley Imani read the email and allowed herself a small, genuine smile. She had never wanted to be the center of the story. She had been forced into that role by one man's prejudice. But in holding her ground, in refusing to be demeaned, she had inadvertently become a catalyst. The hard karma that had fallen on Kevin Miller wasn't just about punishment. It was about correction. It was the system, however flawed and imperfect, slowly, painfully, bending back towards justice. Her stand at O'Hare served as a stark reminder, to her and to the world that had watched the story unfold, that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is to quietly, firmly, and unequivocally refuse to be made small, and that a badge doesn't just represent the power to investigate others. It represents the duty to uphold the rights of everyone, a duty she had honored not just with her shield, but with her unwavering dignity. The story of Dr. Imani Hayes and TSA officer Kevin Miller is a powerful reminder that authority is not the same as power. One man wielded the temporary authority of a uniform, fueled by prejudice, and it crumbled into dust. A woman stood on the foundation of her own integrity and the true power of justice, and she moved a mountain. This wasn't just a confrontation between 2 people. It was a battle between casual bigotry and quiet professionalism, and the outcome was a testament to the fact that, while injustice can be loud and arrogant, the truth has a weight and a silence all its own. The karma in this story wasn't swift or magical. It was procedural, meticulous, and absolute. It was the system, for once, working exactly as it should. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribing to our channel for more real-life stories of drama, justice, and karma. Your support helps us continue to find and tell these important tales. Until next time.